if there is a war between Israel and Iran and the Americans are dragged in, we are looking at $150 oil and Trump will win.
We are speaking to Ian Bremmer, who's a political scientist. He's the president and founder of Eurasia Group, the leading geopolitical risk advisory firm, and also of G0 Media, a company that provides intelligent and engaging coverage of international affairs. Ian, a warm welcome to Times Radio. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
I'm going to get straight into it, if that's okay, and ask you whether entertaining the notion of World War III is fear-mongering.
I think there's a bit of it. I really do. I fear, I mean, I'll tell you, the number of times I've been getting questions from journalists every time Taiwan is in the headlines of whether or not China is going to invade, and that's going to lead to global conflict. Certainly that well exceeds the likelihood of such a conflict and the level of attention we should be paying to it. So I wouldn't say that it's fear-mongering to entertain the question, especially because the world is more dangerous and uncertain now, but it is certainly fear-mongering to kick off lots of interviews with that as your headline. And I appreciate the fact that that's not what you're trying to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. I am fascinated, though, by the potential for flashpoints and instability throughout the world and what that presents to us in terms of risk, but also how we explore solutions as well and deterrence. Let's have a look at sort of potential flashpoints by region, if
Sure.
that's a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Which region, which country presents the biggest threat to global disorder, and why?
Oh, in the near term, and when I say near term, I would say the next, let's say, few months, it's probably Iran and Israel. And in the medium term, say 3-6 months on through 3 years, it's probably Russia. And in the longer term, it's a combination of China, the United States, and the transformations coming from artificial intelligence. So it really depends on how you want to frame it. But as you see in the world today, there are a lot of different areas that are causing real worry of conflict of a scale that we haven't seen for decades.
And let's start to explore some of those areas by starting with Russia, if that's okay. Obviously, it's particularly pertinent for us here in Europe. We spend a lot of time talking about Vladimir Putin, his power, his influence, the strength of NATO, and of the President Zelensky and the army in Ukraine to be able to fight back, to be able to withstand what they're dealing with. How much influence does Putin's power projection have? What are we talking about here when we are concerned about this conflict upsetting global order?
Well, for the last 2 years, we've been principally concerned about the broader economic impact. The fact that energy prices are so much higher in Europe as a consequence of that, and that has depressed European growth. The fact that there have been major disruptions for food and fertilizer that has led to a lot more starvation among the poorest countries in the world, though it could have been a lot worse than it has been. More broadly, of course, you also have the fact that there have been millions of people displaced in Ukraine, many of whom have ended up in Europe, primarily Poland, but other countries too. So that's an impact. And then more broadly, there's the question of to what extent this war could become broader than Ukraine. Now, that hasn't happened with the exception of some small asymmetrical attacks. For example, sort of the fact that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was blown up. The Baltic Connector fiber and gas pipeline was disrupted. But we have seen there was the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, was in Ukraine about a month ago in Odessa. And while he was meeting with the Ukrainian president, a Russian missile hit and exploded only a few hundred meters away from where they were meeting. If that had hit him, we would be in a very different environment. We had a Russian missile, a ballistic missile, go through Polish airspace a couple weeks ago. That's obviously directly in breach of their territorial integrity. They are a NATO ally. So there is the broader question of, might this war get much worse than what we've been seeing inside Ukraine? Finally, we have the fact that the Ukrainians, who are not doing well in the war right now, they are having a hard time with ammunition, with air defense. They're having a hard time raising and mobilizing additional soldiers. They're getting a little more desperate, and that has meant they're more willing to engage in strikes deep into Russian territory. Of course, the potential for that to also lead to broader escalation between the two countries and beyond is also something to think about. So there's a lot of different components of that.
I wonder whether you think Vladimir Putin could return to his original game plan and launch an advance on Kyiv, move to replace Zelensky.
Well, he clearly wants to do that. And indeed, I don't know if you've noticed this, but they have now officially said that this is a war as opposed to a special military operation. So, I mean, it has escalated in the national and popular consciousness as dictated by the Kremlin in past weeks. The question here is the military capabilities. Look, Putin did not misjudge NATO when he invaded Ukraine. He knew that NATO wasn't going to do much. He misjudged his own Russian military because he's an incompetent and corrupt leader who has gotten lazy over time. Therefore, he ordered them to do things that they were not capable of doing, having listened to a bunch of people that were telling him one thing and executing on another. Now that the military is more loyal, is more consolidated, and they've put an enormous amount of both direct economic capability into building up that military following the initial invasion, and they've gotten a lot of support from countries like Iran, North Korea, and increasingly and disturbingly China. Their military capabilities are picking up. Now, I think that the broader immediate military plans and goals they have are about shoring up and taking the rest of the territory that they have formally annexed, but they don't actually control. So, I mean, legally, they say it's theirs. It's not, but they say it is. But they don't actually have troops on the ground. So that's what they're trying to do right now. But more broadly, if they break through Ukraine's defensive lines and you start to see the Ukrainians panicking and withdrawing, I have no doubt in my mind that Putin's intention is still to remove Zelensky from power and have Ukraine governed by a group of people that are much more aligned with Russia, like we see in Minsk in Belarus, as opposed to an implacable enemy of Russia that wants to join both the EU and NATO, which is what's represented by Zelensky.
And that, of course, comes at a time when military stocks are very low. I was reading a piece earlier about someone who'd spent a bit of time with one of the regiments on the front line in Ukraine, and they said it had been a month since they'd had a shell to fire. You know, stocks are worryingly low. What about outside Ukrainian territory? Does NATO offer enough of a deterrent for Vladimir Putin to just focus on Ukrainian territory, or are there wider discussions to think about here?
Well, for now, certainly Russia has had to pull a lot of troops back from their other borders, including, for example, vis-a-vis the Nordics, because they have to focus on this war in Ukraine. Also, about a third of their Black Sea fleet, naval fleet, has been crippled or destroyed by the Ukrainians with support from NATO. So I don't think they have a lot of appetite to open a second front right now. but there has been continued Russian efforts at cyber attacks, at disinformation. This is one of the reasons why French President Macron has become so hawkish vis-a-vis Russia in the past couple of months, because he's been on the receiving end of that disinformation and those asymmetric attacks from Russia. The United States is concerned about that with the upcoming 2024 elections, the Europeans more broadly with the parliamentary elections this summer. And so it depends on how you are thinking about that. But I mean, I'll give you an example. When a couple of Polish farmers were killed on the aftermath of a Russian strike on the Ukrainian border of Poland, and it turned out that it was a Ukrainian air defense system that misfired. But in the immediate aftermath, the Russians did everything they could to show the Poles and NATO that, hey, this wasn't Russia. And the Ukrainians actually said it was Russia. Zelensky came out publicly and said it was Russia. He had no evidence to say that. He just did, because it's war, and disinformation works for both sides. And you could have seen, if the Russians were looking to put NATO on the back foot, you could have easily imagined Putin wanting there to be some uncertainty, saying, yeah, you guys, the Polish government is providing all of the supply chain, their critical infrastructure hubs. Why wouldn't we want them to think that they might take a hit, maybe from Russia, if they keep doing that? And it turns out the Russians didn't want that, because they didn't want to risk the escalation of the Poles and NATO getting directly, as opposed to indirectly, involved in the war.
And what about the alliance between Russia and China, the growing alliance? What could that mean for global insecurity?
Certainly, the Americans have been consistent in telling the Chinese that it is unacceptable for them to provide direct military support to Russia in a way that the Iranians and North Koreans have been. And of course, those countries are maximally sanctioned by the United States and by many around the world. The Chinese are not. There are tariffs, there are export controls, but generally the US and China do a lot of business with each other. So it's hard for the Americans to tell the Chinese, don't do this or else. And it's also very costly for both if the Chinese decide, who have an economy that isn't performing so well right now, that they want to lean into that. Now, we know that the Chinese have given a lot of low-level semiconductors to Russia, a lot of things that can be considered dual use in support of the war machine. But more recently, there's been evidence that the Chinese are also providing missiles, engines for ballistic missiles, for example, and other componentry that is directly used in the Russian military. And it's not clear whether this is Chinese private sector that may be operating to make some money, but outside of the direct order of the Chinese government, or whether these are state-owned enterprises that the Chinese actually have full visibility and awareness of. But I will say that when Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen went to Beijing a week ago, she was very clear and direct with the Chinese that this would not be tolerated. And that message coming from her definitely puts the Chinese on notice that real sanctions will be coming if this becomes a big deal.
Yeah.
It'll be very interesting to see, because U.S.-China relations have been comparatively stable and friendly, though certainly not trusted, since the Woodside Summit between Biden and Xi Jinping back on the sidelines of APEC in November. But this would be a significant challenge and change in trajectory of U.S.-China relations if it persists.
Let's focus on the Middle East now. Israel hasn't claimed responsibility for the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. It provoked a direct attack on Israel by Iran. Surely Israel knew the risk of escalating a conflict that they say they don't want.
Israel is facing a number of enemies in this Iran-led so-called axis of resistance. of terrorist organizations that do not recognize the right of Israel to exist. And Iran has provided intelligence and military equipment to that group of actors, including with Iranian military officials on the ground. And that was the target that the Israelis hit in Damascus. It was not just taking out an Iranian military leader, it was doing so in an Iranian consular
Mm,
building. So it did break precedent in that regard. And the Iranians responded by breaking precedent, by sending 300 plus missiles and drones against Israel. Now, the Iranians gave a heads up on those attacks to the United States through Turkey and Iraq, and also sent slow-moving drones first, which meant that the Israelis certainly had plenty of time to get their civilians into bomb shelters to help to ensure that you didn't have lots of people getting killed. But this was a major escalation in the war across the Middle East that we're seeing right now. You can't just talk about the war being in Gaza. It's broader
mm,
than that. And yes, I think the Israelis knew that they were precipitating what would likely be an escalatory
mm.
response.
Why did
Um,
they do it though? Why, I suppose, is the question everyone's asking.
well,
Why risk it?
one is they wanted to deter the Iranians from using their military to directly support these terrorist organizations that are targeting Israel in addition to others in the region. So they wanted to reestablish a level of deterrence, say this wouldn't be tolerated. It's not like Israel engaged in strikes directly in Iran, which would have been a higher bar to break. It's not like they were targeting civilians, which would have been a higher bar. They didn't do that. This was a limited one-off strike. They probably also were thinking about the fact that back when Trump had ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani at the end of his administration, the Iranian response, there was a response, but it was quite a limited and weak response. Then you have the fact that the Israeli prime minister, who doesn't run the war cabinet by himself, but he's clearly very important, knows that if he is able to get much more support vis-a-vis Iran from the region and from the West, that means he's more likely to stay in power for a longer period of time. If he's forced out, he's facing a lot of domestic pressure. He could end up in jail. So there's a willingness of the Israeli prime minister to accept greater risks if that means the Americans can get dragged into a war with Iran, something the Biden administration is very concerned about. And of course, you saw that the United States provided ironclad defense assurances to the Israelis, helped ensure the defense of Israel as the missiles were coming in. A bear hug that included the decision to send the commander of CENTCOM to Israel in the hours preceding the Iranian attack. I mean, Israel today benefits from stronger US support, stronger UK support, support at least in principle in kind from Jordan, from Saudi Arabia, and a world that is spending more time talking about Iran than Gaza, including your questions to me in this conversation.
It's true.
All of that is useful for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's a distraction, isn't it, from what's happening in Gaza, but also the death of those humanitarian workers a couple of weeks ago. 3 Brits among them.
Well, and of
Where
course,
did
there've been well over 100 humanitarian aid workers that have
Yeah.
died since October 7th, and the fact that virtually no focus in the Western media until it included Americans and Brits is part of the problem here.
Where does conflict in the Middle East go next?
Well, we're right now in a de-escalatory cycle. The Israelis will do something, but that something is almost certain to be more restrained than the strikes in Damascus. And I think there is risk inherent, of course, in that. But it's likely that we're seeing, essentially a close to this episode. But having said that, The Iranians are still supporting these proxies, and I don't expect that to stop, not with the Houthis in Yemen, not with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and not with the militias in Syria or Iraq, nor with Hamas, for that matter. And so we are at a higher level of displayed violence between Iran and Israel without having established stability or peace. So that's more dangerous. You've got the Houthis still engaging in strikes in the Red Sea, and the possibility of them getting through and injuring or killing some American or British servicemen or women. That obviously would engender a military response in the region that could include Iran. That's more dangerous too. And it's with the distraction away from Gaza, that empowers Hamas to a degree and makes them less likely to feel like they have to give up some of these hostages to get a 6-week ceasefire. And it also empowers Netanyahu and his war cabinet to proceed with the ground war on Rafah. I mean, as I'm speaking to you right now, there are continued airstrikes in Rafah. There was an ultimatum from the United States, don't do this or else. They're probably more willing to at least proceed with some of those intended attacks, as has been telegraphed by the Israeli war cabinet, making the war in Gaza itself more bloody with more civilian casualties. So I don't see this going anywhere good in the near to medium term. The final point here, of course, is that the U.S. has elections in November. This is relevant for oil prices being a little bit higher, around $90 right now. A majority of Democrats intending to vote for Biden are closer to the Palestinian position politically than the Israeli position. This war is more likely to go on until November now. It is more likely that the Israeli prime minister will still be in power in November now. And that is a very significant worry for the American president. It makes it a little more likely that Biden loses the events we've seen in the Middle East over the last week. And I am certain that Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that. He understands that if there is a war between Israel and Iran and the Americans are dragged in, we are looking at $150 oil and Trump will win. That certainly is something that Israeli leaders are thinking about. It's influencing their calculation. It's not the only factor. It's not the determinative factor, but it is a factor, and we should talk about it.
If Trump does secure a second term as president, and I'll ask you to be fairly brief on this one, what does that mean for global order? What does that mean for the situation in the Middle East, spiking or de-escalating?
It means more uncertainty. In a place like the border of U.S.-Mexico, it means that Trump will push much harder, much more willing to have economic consequences that are dire for Mexico unless they shore up their southern border and they cooperate more with the U.S. military. And the next Mexican president will do that. So it's a tail risk, but it's likely to be more upside in U.S.-Mexico relations and integration. In a place like Europe, Trump is going to take away aid for Ukraine. He's going to squeeze the Ukrainians a lot harder. That's useful for Putin. It's bad for Europe. And then in the Middle East, I think it's much more uncertain. It's a question of how lucky you feel, because I think that I could see Trump very unwilling to use U.S. military force. I can see him much more willing to use his good relations with the Gulf states to try to pursue normalization with Israel and Saudi Arabia. But I could also see, if he gets angry with the Iranians, he thinks he's being disrespected, I could see him doing something spectacular that could risk a much broader war. So I think that the risks, both upside and downside, become much greater if Trump becomes president.
Look, you're concerned about AI. Let's take a look at one of these other flashpoints. Concerned about AI enabling a shift from human war to machine war. What would that
It's
look
happening.
like?
It's happening already. It's already happening in Gaza. And I think that the more quickly it happens, the more other countries feel like they have to move to AI too, because otherwise they'll be at a disadvantage. And very quickly, you're taking the human out of the equation when you talk about warfighting. And that means targeting, That means real-time decision making and how wars are actually fought and who gets killed and when you pull the trigger and when you don't pull the trigger. And obviously that can create unintended consequences, can change the nature of power asymmetries around the world. It can lead to escalation that nobody really wanted. It can also lead to a lot more people getting killed. So yes, I worry about taking humans out of the equation in war fighting. I think it's happening very quickly. I also worry that the dominance that the United States presently has in its in being the only power that can project military authority around the world with its global bases and its massive supply for a blue water navy and nuclear force and all the rest, that's something that could be very, very disrupted very quickly if AI creates weapons and creates disinformation that can affect and disrupt existing weapon systems that can be used and manipulated by a rogue actor, whether that's a government or a corporation or even a terrorist organization. I think that these things are moving very, very quickly.
And we could be talking about, look, we're already seeing unmanned drones, but we could be talking about unmanned fighter jets and bombers.
That is the plan in the United States, certainly, is to move in that direction. They're a lot cheaper, and you're not risking the life of the pilot. They can fly for longer. They can fly in formation. They can be smaller. They can still carry payload. I mean, they can
And
deal
are
with
they
more
still
G.
operated by humans? Sorry
Absolutely.
to interrupt. Are they still operated by humans? Is there a role still for human diligence in this?
Well, yes, of course. To begin with, they are. They'll all be. I'm sure that initially they'll all be, completely remote controlled in every way, and then you'll take the human out of a lot of the operations. But you'll still have a human being when you're making a final decision on whether or not to deploy payload. But then over time, you'll start. Those decisions will become faster and faster, and there'll be drone aircraft against drone aircraft as opposed to just fixed targets. And when that happens, human beings won't be it. You can say, well, you'll make a decision to engage, but not when to fire. And then, well, maybe you won't have time to make a decision to engage. So, you see that very quickly you are shifting the barriers to entry of what a human being is capable of making a decision and doing and still maintaining a security advantage.
Is there enough in the structures of the way the world, the globe operates, our geopolitics, our, permanent bastions of peace, the way that we live our life, the way that global order works? Is there enough in there to prevent machines, AI, taking over the world?
AI is not going to take over the world. At least not in the foreseeable future. The AI that is being developed does not have consciousness, does not have intent. The intent is being programmed. So the question is the geopolitical order strong enough to resist human beings that program AI to allow those human beings to take over the world? That's the question, or to disrupt the world, or to endanger the world. That's the question. And I think we don't know the answer to that question right now. We really don't. I think that these systems are incredibly powerful. They're transformative. They're moving very fast, much faster than governments have the ability to understand them, never mind to constrain and regulate them. And for now, the United States is not only the dominant military power, but is also the dominant AI power. But of course, it's not the United States government. It's a number of companies that are based in the United States, but they have different missions and different footprints and different priorities and different business plans than each other and then the U.S. government. And it's not clear that's going to be fully aligned. And it's not clear that those companies are going to continue to be the only dominant players in terms of AI being used for massive disruptions in the global security environment. And I'm not talking about 20 years away. I'm talking about 3. So in that regard, this is a very important real-time question for us to be having. It's a much more important question, much more urgent question than whether China becomes the world's largest economy and what does that mean for the geopolitical order. I mean, all those books written about the Chinese century, we don't have the luxury of talking about centuries anymore. The technology revolution is moving too quickly for that.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for speaking to us. There is a lot for us to digest there, quite a bit to worry about, a bit to contemplate over.
My
Ian, it's
pleasure.
been a real pleasure
Yeah,
speaking
sure.
to you. Thank you. Ian Bremmer, political scientist, the writer of many books. You can check out Ian's work online, and you can also have a look at what he does at the Eurasia Group and at G0 Media as well. Ian Bremmer, thank you.